A billionaire slammed his fist on a table set with $1,000 wine and screamed across a silent dining room. "Where's the chef? Bring me the chef now!" 112 faces turned toward the kitchen door. Nobody came out. Then, slowly, every eye in that room drifted to the same person. A black woman in a waitress uniform, standing by table 14 with a cleared plate still in her hand. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She just stood there perfectly still while the most powerful man in Charleston stared at her like she was furniture. What he didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that the notebook tucked inside her apron pocket was about to destroy a celebrity chef's career, expose a multi-million-dollar lie, and force a billionaire to his knees. The back door of Orem opened into a narrow alley that smelled like grease traps and rain-soaked brick. This was where the dishwashers came to smoke, where nobody important ever stood. Nadine sat down on a milk crate, still wearing the apron she never should have had on. Her hands were steady, her face was dry, but something behind her eyes had gone quiet, the way a flame looks right before it either dies or catches everything on fire. She pulled the notebook from her apron pocket, small, barely bigger than her palm. The cover was soft from years of handling, stained with turmeric and oil, the spine wrapped in packing tape her grandmother had pressed down 20 years ago. Every page filled with handwriting that wasn't hers, looping, elegant, written by a woman who never finished school but could make a $2 fish taste like royalty. Meme Josephine. She opened a random page. She crab soup. In the margin, faded pencil. "Season with patience, baby. The flavor comes when you stop rushing." Nadine closed the notebook, pressed it to her chest. Called Marcus. Marcus Cole, sous chef at Orem for 3 years, the only person who knew the full truth, who had watched Nadine build every dish while Julian Mercer smiled for the cameras and took the credit. He picked up on the second ring. "I'm done," Nadine said. "I'm not going back." "What happened?" He looked right at me and said, "Not the waitress," like I was in the way of his answer. Marcus exhaled. He'd spent years watching smaller versions of this. Nadine's name left off credits, her photo absent from press kits, her ideas presented by Julian as his own. But this was public. This was loud. "Go home," Marcus said quietly. "Hold your baby. We'll figure this out." Inside the restaurant, the gala continued like nothing happened. The fourth course arrived. Low-country risotto with smoked oysters that Nadine had perfected over 6 weeks. A food critic from Atlanta put down her pen and sat in silence. Richard was holding court at the head table when David appeared at his elbow. "Mr.
Ashworth.
About earlier, the woman you saw. She actually works in the kitchen. She's been running the line since Chef Mercer left." Richard frowned. "Mercer left? When?" 4 months ago, sir." 4 months. The James Beard nomination, the critics calling the menu visionary, all of it created by a team Julian Mercer hadn't touched. Richard processed this slowly. "So, who's been—" "Nadine, sir. Nadine Leclerc. She's been developing the menu since she arrived. Chef Mercer would present her work." A waiter passing behind them muttered, just loud enough, "It's Nadine. It's always been Nadine." Richard said nothing. He picked up his fork, put it down. The risotto sat in front of him, perfect, made by hands he had dismissed 15 minutes ago. Something small and sharp lodged itself under his ribs. Across town, Nadine unlocked her apartment door. Her neighbor had put Zuri to bed, but the girl was still awake with that stubborn patience only 7-year-olds possess. "Mama! Look what I drew!" Nadine knelt down. The drawing showed a woman in a tall, white hat standing in a big kitchen. Above it, in a wobbly crayon, "Mama's Restaurant." Nadine's throat tightened. On the fridge behind them, 3 identical drawings were already pinned. Zuri's ongoing vision of a future her mother had never dared speak aloud. "Did they like your food tonight, Mama?" Nadine thought about the billionaire's face, awe twisting into something else entirely. "They liked the food, baby. They just didn't see me." Zuri frowned. That's dumb. You're right there. She tucked Zuri in, kissed her forehead, turned off the light. Then sat at the kitchen table in the dark and opened the notebook to the last page. The final entry Meme Josephine ever wrote 2 weeks before she died. A recipe for butter cake. Below it, shaky handwriting, "You carry this forward now, Nadine. Don't let nobody tell you these ain't yours." The next morning, Richard arrived at Orem alone. Before the prep cooks, before David, before anyone. He told himself it was a routine walkthrough. Normal billionaire things. But his feet carried him past the dining room, past the bar, all the way to the back prep station, the smallest corner of the kitchen. Nadine's station. There, on the steel counter between clean towels and kosher salt, sat the notebook. She'd left it behind. In the dignity of her exit, she had forgotten the one thing she never let out of her sight. Richard picked it up, opened to a page tabbed Orem number 7. Seared grouper, gullah butter, Meme's way, never shortcut the roux. Toast the spices dry first. Listen to the oil, it tells you when it's ready. The exact dish. James Beard nominated. Attributed to Julian Mercer in every article, every press release. And here it was, in an old woman's handwriting, in a notebook that smelled like a home kitchen where love was the first ingredient. He turned pages. Every recipe matched. The she-crab soup. The smoked oyster risotto. The bourbon pecan tart is a magazine called A Masterpiece. All of it, predating Orem by decades. Julian Mercer's name did not appear on a single page. Richard called Julian, New York. Smooth voice, relaxed, the voice of a man who'd never been caught. Tell me about Nadine Leclerc. A pause, a fraction too long. Nadine? Talented, sure. Solid line cook. She assisted on development, gave notes. But the vision, that was mine. I elevated the raw material. Richard looked at the notebook, at Meme Josephine's handwriting. That's what you do, he repeated quietly. Absolutely. If she's making noise about credit, kitchen politics, you know how it is. Richard hung up, sat in the empty kitchen holding a dead woman's notebook, and for the first time in a career built on certainty, he did not know what to do. That evening, Nadine sat on her apartment floor while Zuri slept. She hummed a gullah lullaby Meme Josephine used to sing on Edisto Island. No words she could fully remember, just the melody, carried in her chest like a second heartbeat. The song drifted past Zuri's room, past the crayon drawings on the fridge, and settled into the silence like a promise not yet broken. But while Nadine hummed her grandmother's song, a billionaire sat alone in her kitchen holding her grandmother's notebook, and the truth inside those stained pages was about to force a choice that no amount of money could buy his way out of. 3 days passed before Richard made contact. He didn't call himself, he sent his assistant, a young woman in a pressed blazer who knocked on Nadine's apartment door at 9 in the morning while Zuri was eating cereal. Nadine opened the door halfway. The assistant smiled the kind of smile people are trained to give when they represent someone powerful. Ms. Leclerc, Mr. Ashworth would like to arrange a meeting. At his office. Nadine looked past her at the black town car idling at the curb. Tinted windows, a driver in a suit. The whole machinery of wealth sent to collect her like a package. "Tell Mr. Ashworth I don't have a uniform on this time," Nadine said. "He might not recognize me." She closed the door. But that night Marcus called. Richard had been asking real questions, not the kind a man asks to protect his brand, but the kind that keeps him awake. "This might be your one shot," Marcus said. "Not for him, for you, for Zuri, for Meme." Nadine looked at the crayon drawings on the fridge. 4 kitchens, 4 chef hats, 4 versions of a future that kept getting drawn but never built. Fine, but not his office, not his hotel, not anywhere with his name on the walls. They met at the East Side Community Center. Fluorescent lights, plastic chairs, linoleum floors. A bulletin board covered in flyers for free tax prep. Coffee from a machine that took quarters. This was Nadine's ground. Richard arrived with Lorraine, his wife. Italian shoes on scuffed tile, cashmere coat in a room where the heating barely worked. He stood near the entrance like a man who'd walked into the wrong building and was too proud to leave. Nadine was already seated. She didn't stand, didn't smile, didn't offer her hand. Richard sat down and began the way he began every negotiation, with positioning. "Nadine, I've been reviewing the situation at Orem, and I think there's an opportunity here for both." "Stop." One word, quiet, but it landed like a blade. "Before you say anything," she said, "I need you to know what you did. You stood in a room full of people eating food I made with my grandmother's hands. You asked for the genius, and when they pointed at me, you saw a black woman in an apron and decided that was the whole story." Richard's jaw tightened. "I'm not done." She sat back, folded her hands, and her voice shifted. Not anger, not hurt, but the steady weight of a woman who had prepared for this moment her entire life, without knowing it was coming. "I'll come back to Orem, but not as your ghost. These are my terms." One finger. "My name goes on the menu, not fine print, at the top, every dish." Second finger. "I run my kitchen, no shadow chef, no man presenting my work, my menu, my call, my face." Third finger. "You fund a scholarship for young black cooks who never got a seat at the table because nobody handed them a degree." Fourth finger. "My grandmother's name goes on the signature dish, permanently. She was Josephine Leclerc. She created that recipe 40 years before your restaurant existed." Fifth finger. Her whole open hand in the air, 5 conditions, the full span of what dignity looks like when it stops asking and starts requiring. "And you apologize, not through lawyers, not through PR. You stand in front of every person who was in that room, say my name, say what you did, and mean it." Silence. Down the hall, a basketball bounced. A child laughed. The coffee machine hummed. Richard sat still. This was not a negotiation he recognized. No leverage, no counteroffer, no bonus to make the problem disappear. Just a woman with empty hands and full certainty, asking for what had always been hers. "I need time," he said. His voice was smaller now. Nadine stood, pushed her chair in, looked down at him, and for the first time, the geometry of power reversed completely. He was seated. She was standing. He was asking for time. She had already waited a lifetime. "Take your time. I've been waiting my whole life. A few more days won't break me." She walked out. No dramatic exit. Just steady footsteps on linoleum, growing quieter until the only sound was Richard breathing in a plastic chair under fluorescent lights, in a building where his name meant nothing. Lorraine touched his arm. "She's not asking for too much, Richard. She's asking for exactly enough." That same evening, Marcus sat at Nadine's kitchen table and laid his phone between them. "I need to show you something. Something I've been keeping for 3 years." He opened a folder. Hundreds of files. Time-stamped photos of Nadine developing dishes, plating, tasting, writing notes. Videos of her working the line at 5 in the morning while Julian's station sat empty. Screenshots of Julian's texts. "Just make that thing you made Tuesday. I'll handle the presentation." And, "Don't come to the press dinner. I'll represent the kitchen." 3 years of evidence. Every lie documented by the one man who stood close enough to see the truth. Nadine stared at the phone. "Why did you keep all this?" Marcus looked at her the way a man looks when he's been carrying something heavy for years and is finally allowed to set it down. "Because somebody was always going to ask where the chef was. And I wanted to make sure they got the right answer." That weekend, she took Zuri to Edisto Island. They walked the beach where Meme Josephine used to cook oysters over open fire, feeding anyone who passed by. Zuri picked up shells. Nadine told stories. How Meme could shuck an oyster in 3 seconds. How she sang while she cooked. How she once fed 37 people from a single pot of rice. "I want to cook like Meme," Zuri said, holding a shell to the light. Nadine smiled, the first real smile in days. "You already do, baby. You just don't know it yet." The ocean kept coming in. For one afternoon, the world was just a mother, a daughter, and the memory of a woman whose recipes were about to change everything. But peace never lasts when powerful men have something to lose. And back in Charleston, Richard was about to discover that giving Nadine her name was the easy part. The hard part was what he'd have to take from Julian Mercer to do it. Richard went home that night and sat in his study for 2 hours without turning on the lights. Lorraine found him there, the notebook open on his desk. He hadn't asked permission to take it. David had kept it after Nadine left, and Richard had taken it from the restaurant that morning, telling himself he needed it for due diligence. But that wasn't why he kept turning the pages. He wasn't auditing recipes. He was reading a woman's life. Lorraine stood in the doorway and watched him for a moment before speaking. "How long are you going to sit here pretending you're thinking about business?" Richard didn't look up. "I built this company on taste, Lorraine, on knowing what's excellent. And I looked at the most talented person in my building and told her she was the waitress." "Yes, you did." No softening, no comfort, just fact. That was Lorraine. She loved him enough to never let him hide. "My mother cleaned houses for 40 years, Lorraine said, stepping into the room. She cooked for families on King Street, the old money families, the ones with silver that had been in the family for generations. They loved her food. They served it at Christmas parties. They told their friends about her sweet potato pie like it was their own secret recipe." She paused. "They never learned her last name." Richard looked up. Her name was Dolores Carter, and she could have run any kitchen in this city if someone had bothered to open the door. The room was quiet. Lorraine sat down across from him. "You found that notebook and you knew, Richard. You knew the moment you read the first page. The question isn't whether Nadine is the real chef. The question is what kind of man you're going to be now that you can't pretend you didn't know." She left him alone with that. Richard sat in the dark, turning pages. Meme Josephine's handwriting filled every margin, little notes that weren't about cooking at all. "Nadine took her first steps today, right into the kitchen, Lord help me." And on another page, "Josephine Leclerc, born 1941, Edisto Island. Never left, fed everyone, asked for nothing." Richard closed the notebook gently, like closing something sacred. The next morning he called Nadine. Not his assistant, not David, Richard himself, from his personal phone. "I'd like to come to you," he said. "Not to negotiate, I just want to watch you cook, if you'll let me." Nadine was quiet for a long time, long enough that Richard thought she'd hung up. "Come to the community center kitchen," she finally said. "Thursday, 10 o'clock. Don't bring lawyers." He arrived alone. No blazer, no driver, just Richard in a plain shirt, standing in a community kitchen with industrial fluorescent lights and donated pots that didn't match. Nadine was already at the stove, an apron tied over a simple white t-shirt, her hair wrapped. She didn't greet him warmly. She simply nodded toward a stool in the corner. "Sit there, don't touch anything." And then she cooked. She started with gullah rice, the way Meme Josephine made it, with shrimp from the creek and tomatoes that had been stewing since dawn. She moved through the kitchen like water through a riverbed. No wasted motion, no hesitation, every gesture carrying the memory of 10,000 repetitions. She didn't perform. She didn't explain. She just cooked, and the room filled with a smell so layered and alive that Richard's eyes changed. He watched her hands, the way she tilted the pot, not measuring heat with a thermometer, but with her palm held 3 inches above the surface. The way she crumbled dried herbs between her fingers and lifted them to her nose before deciding how much. The way she whispered something he couldn't hear each time she added the first pinch of salt. When the dish was finished, she set a plate in front of him. No garnish, no presentation, just food. Richard tasted it. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, something had shifted in his face. Not a businessman evaluating a product, but a person encountering something that reached past his defenses and touched the part of him that still remembered what food was supposed to mean. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked quietly. "Since I could reach the stove. Meme had me stirring roux when I was 5. I burned my hand 3 times that first year. She said the stove was teaching me to pay attention." "And Julian?" Nadine's expression flattened. "Julian could plate. He could talk to cameras. He could shake hands with food critics and make them feel special, but he couldn't cook. Not like this. Not with memory in his hands. Richard set down the fork. He didn't argue. He didn't defend. He just nodded. A small voice came from the doorway. "Mama, is that the hotel man?" Zuri stood there in her school uniform, backpack still on, having been dropped off by Mrs. Patterson. She walked straight toward Richard with the fearless curiosity of a child who hasn't yet learned to be intimidated by wealth. She was holding a piece of paper. "Look," she said, and held it up directly in front of Richard's face. The drawing, Nadine in a tall white chef's hat, standing in a bright kitchen, with a sign above that read, "Mama's Restaurant." "Are you going to put my mama's name on the restaurant?" Richard looked at the drawing, looked at Nadine, looked back at Zuri. Something cracked in him, not dramatically, not loudly, but the way ice cracks on a river when the season finally turns. "I'm going to try," he said. Zuri tilted her head. "Don't try. Do it. My teacher says trying is just a fancy word for maybe." Nadine almost called Zuri back, almost apologized for her daughter's bluntness. But she didn't, because Zuri had just said the thing that every adult in this story had been circling around for days, and she'd said it in 7 seconds flat. Richard looked at that little girl and had nothing to offer but the truth. "You're right," he said. "I'll do it." Later, after Zuri had gone to the back room to do homework, Richard asked about the notebook. Nadine told him its story, how Meme Josephine started writing recipes at 16, how the notebook survived a house fire on Edisto Island in 1987, how the burnt edges on page 47 were from that night, how the last entry was written 2 weeks before she died. "This book is the only inheritance I have," Nadine said. "Not money, not property, just this. These pages are my grandmother's voice, and Julian tried to put his name on every single one." Richard was quiet for a long time. Then he asked carefully, not as a businessman, but as someone beginning to understand what sacred meant. "Would you allow me to have it photographed and archived? Properly, by a cultural historian, so it's preserved." Nadine hesitated. She looked at the notebook on the counter, its taped spine, its oil-stained pages, its 40 years of love pressed between covers that were barely holding together. She'd never let anyone else hold it. Not Julian, not David, not anyone in the restaurant. She picked it up, held it for a moment, then placed it in Richard's hands. "Be careful with it," she said. "That's not a book. That's my grandmother breathing." Richard received it the way a man receives something he knows he doesn't deserve. Gently, with both hands, and with the quiet understanding that trust, once given, cannot be dropped. Over the next 2 weeks, things began to move. Richard arranged for Nadine to walk through Orum's kitchen, not as a visitor, but as its new head chef. She came on a Monday morning when the restaurant was closed. Marcus met her at the door with a grin he'd been holding back for 3 years. She walked through slowly, touched the stations, rearranged the spice rack, moved the prep table 6 inches to the left because the light was better there, stood at the pass, the place where finished plates wait before going to the dining room, and placed her hands flat on the steel surface. This was hers. It had always been hers. And now, for the first time, the room knew it. She brought one thing from home, a framed photograph of Meme Josephine, black and white, taken on Edisto Island in 1978. In the photo, Josephine was standing over an outdoor stove, laughing, steam rising around her face like a halo. Nadine hung the photograph on the kitchen wall, right where every cook would see it the moment they walked in. Beneath it, she taped a small handwritten card. The original chef. Marcus stood behind her and said nothing. He didn't need to. Some moments speak louder in silence. That evening, Nadine cooked dinner at home with Zuri. Nothing fancy, just rice and beans, the way Meme made it on weeknights when the budget was thin and the love was not. Zuri helped by tasting everything with a wooden spoon and declaring each bite either amazing or needs more cheese. The notebook sat open on the counter between them, its pages catching the kitchen light. Nadine watched her daughter lean over it, sounding out Meme Josephine's handwriting letter by letter. What's this word, Mama? Patience. What about this one? Love. Zuri nodded seriously, as if she were studying a textbook for the most important subject in the world. And maybe she was. For one evening, everything was warm. Everything was enough. A kitchen, a child, a notebook, the smell of something good becoming ready. But 300 miles north, in a Manhattan high-rise, Julian Mercer had just received a phone call from a Charleston journalist asking about recipe attribution. And the smooth, charming smile he'd worn for years was about to come apart at the seams. Julian Mercer had spent his entire career building an image. The tailored chef's coat, the effortless smile on camera, the way he could describe a dish using words like terroir and deconstruction, while making middle-aged food critics feel like they were having an intellectual experience. He was handsome, articulate, classically trained. Or at least that's what his bio said. And he had turned himself into the kind of chef who was famous not for cooking, but for being seen. So when the Charleston food journalist Diane Osei called his publicist asking about recipe attribution concerns at Orem, Julian didn't panic. He did what he always did. He got ahead of the story. Within 48 hours, Julian's agent contacted 3 major food media outlets with a carefully constructed narrative. Nadine Leclerc was a talented kitchen assistant who was exaggerating her contributions after being passed over for promotion. Julian had mentored her generously and was disappointed but not surprised by her claims. The statement ended with a line so polished it practically gleamed. In any great kitchen, many hands contribute, but vision belongs to the chef. Then he went further. Julian filed a legal claim through the hotel's original employment contracts, asserting that all recipes created during Nadine's time at Orem were work product, intellectual property owned by the restaurant and, by extension, developed under his creative direction. His lawyers argued that Nadine had been hired as a line cook, that any dishes she developed fell under the scope of her employment, and that Julian, as executive chef, held creative authority over all menu output. He went on a popular food podcast, relaxed, laughing, shaking his head with rehearsed disbelief. "Look, I gave her a chance. I brought her into a James Beard kitchen when nobody else would have looked at her resume twice. And this is what gratitude looks like in 2025, apparently." The host laughed along. Nobody asked a follow-up question. But Julian wasn't done. His lawyers filed for a temporary restraining order, seeking to prevent Nadine from cooking his recipes at Orem or any other establishment. If granted, it would mean that Nadine Leclerc could be legally barred from preparing her own grandmother's food in a professional kitchen. The news hit the internet like gasoline on a spark. Within hours, the story split social media down the middle. On one side, #NadineIsTheChef began trending. Thousands of people sharing the story, posting photos of their own grandmother's kitchens, writing about the cooks in their families who never got credit. A black chef in Atlanta posted a video that went viral overnight. They want to own her grandmother's recipes? They want to put a restraining order on heritage? This ain't about work product. This is about who gets to own black excellence. On the other side, a louder, uglier chorus emerged. Comment sections filled with the kind of poison that hides behind anonymous profile pictures. "She's just a line cook with a sob story. If she was really that talented, why didn't she have her own restaurant? Julian built that menu. She's riding his coattails." And worse, much worse, the kind of words that people type when they think nobody's watching. Words that had nothing to do with cooking and everything to do with the color of Nadine's skin. A cable news segment ran the debate under the banner, "Who really owns a recipe?" 2 pundits argued while Nadine's employee photo, the only one the network could find, taken on her first day at Orem, unsmiling in a hairnet, sat frozen on screen next to Julian's professional headshot, all white teeth and studio lighting. Nadine watched the coverage from her couch. Zuri was asleep on her lap, one hand curled around Nadine's finger. The television light flickered across both their faces. Marcus called, It's getting ugly out there. Are you okay? Nadine looked at the screen. A man she'd never met was explaining on national television why her grandmother's recipes belonged to a man who couldn't make a roux without Google. "I'm not okay," she said quietly. "But I'm not stopping." The next morning, Diane Osei published her piece. Diane had been investigating Julian's cookbook deal for months, long before the gala, long before the humiliation. She'd noticed inconsistencies in his proposal. Recipes that referenced low-country ingredients Julian had never used before Nadine arrived. Techniques rooted in Gullah Geechee tradition that didn't match Julian's French classical training. Flavor profiles that shifted dramatically 18 months ago, exactly when Nadine was hired. The article was titled, "The Ghost Chef: How a Gullah Cook Built a James Beard Menu and Got Erased." It was methodical, devastating. Diane had obtained kitchen logs showing that Nadine clocked in hours before Julian on every menu development day. Supplier invoices proved Nadine had personally ordered Edisto Island blue crab, Sea Island red peas, and Carolina gold rice, ingredients that never appeared on Orum's orders before her arrival. Marcus's time-stamped photos showed Nadine developing dishes alone in the kitchen at 5 in the morning, and side-by-side comparisons of the notebook's recipes with Julian's cookbook proposal revealed that 14 of 16 dishes were direct adaptations of Meme Josephine's work. The article included one photograph that would be shared over 2 million times in the first week. Nadine's notebook, open to the Gullah butter grouper recipe, placed next to the corresponding page from Julian's cookbook proposal. Same ingredients, same method, same soul, stripped of its origin and dressed in Julian's name. Julian's publisher issued a statement within hours, calling the allegations concerning and announcing an internal review. His agent stopped returning calls, but the damage was already moving in both directions. Richard's board of directors called an emergency meeting. The Ashworth Grand Hotel brand was now at the center of a national firestorm. Lawyers recommended immediate distance from Nadine. Frame the situation as an internal HR matter. Release a neutral statement. Let the legal process play out. Protect the brand. Protect the stock price. Protect the name. Richard sat at the head of the boardroom table, 14 executives staring at him, waiting for the decision that would define how this story ended. That night, Lorraine found him in his study again. Same chair, same darkness. "The board wants me to step back from Nadine," he said. Lorraine didn't sit down. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "You found that notebook and you knew, Richard. You sat in that community center and you heard every word she said. You watched her cook. You held her grandmother's recipes in your hands." Her voice didn't rise, but it hardened. "If you hide behind lawyers now, you're not just failing her. You're choosing to be the system that crushed her, and you'll have to live with that for the rest of your life." Richard stared at the floor. The board's recommendations sat on his desk, a printed memo with bullet points and risk assessments and liability projections. Next to it sat Meme Josephine's notebook, still open to the page that read, "Season with patience, baby." He picked up his phone. Not the board's number, Nadine's. She answered on the fourth ring. She sounded tired, the kind of tired that sleep can't fix. "I'm not backing down," Richard said. "The board wants distance. I'm choosing proximity. Tell me what you need." Nadine was quiet. Then, "I need you to mean that tomorrow too, not just tonight." "I will." "Then I need a lawyer, a real one, not yours, mine." Richard made calls that night. By morning, a young attorney named Keisha Warren from the Charleston Civil Rights Legal Clinic had taken the case pro bono. She was 31, sharp as a scalpel, and she had spent 3 years fighting intellectual property theft in communities where people's work was taken because nobody expected them to fight back. Julian's lawyers escalated. The temporary restraining order hearing was set for the following week. If the judge granted it, Nadine would be legally prohibited from cooking Meme Josephine's recipes in any commercial kitchen, a ruling that would effectively erase her grandmother's legacy from the professional world entirely. The night before the hearing, Nadine sat alone at her kitchen table. Zuri was asleep. The apartment was dark except for the light above the stove. She opened the notebook to a page near the middle, one she hadn't read in months. Meme Josephine's handwriting slanted and sure. "They'll tell you it ain't yours, baby. Don't you believe it. The flavor knows where it came from." Nadine pressed her fingers against the words like she could feel her grandmother's hand beneath the ink. The next morning, Marcus showed up at her door at 7 a.m., carrying a paper bag. Inside was a container of she-crab soup, made from the notebook, Meme Josephine's exact recipe, prepared in his own kitchen at 4 in the morning. "Figured you shouldn't have to cook for yourself tonight," he said. Nadine took the container, lifted the lid. The steam rose and caught the morning light coming through the window, and the smell was Edisto Island. It was Sunday afternoon. It was Meme's kitchen. It was every safe place Nadine had ever known compressed into a single breath. She tasted it, and she cried. Not from sadness, not from fear, but because someone else had honored the recipe correctly, had treated it with the same reverence she did. And in that small, quiet act, she felt less alone than she had in years. Marcus put his hand on her shoulder, said nothing, stayed. Tomorrow, Nadine would walk into a courtroom where a man with expensive lawyers would try to legally own her grandmother's love. But she would walk in carrying something no contract could claim and no judge could take: the truth, the evidence, and the steady, unbreakable knowledge that the flavor always knows where it came from. The courtroom was standing room only, not because the case was legally complex, recipe disputes rarely drew crowds, but somewhere between Diane's article and 2 million shares of that notebook photograph, this had stopped being a legal matter and become something larger, something that touched every person who had ever created something beautiful and watched someone else sign their name to it. Nadine arrived early. Simple black dress, no jewelry, hair pulled back the way she wore it in the kitchen. The notebook in her bag. Keisha Warren walked beside her, composed, carrying a single file folder that contained 3 years of evidence. Marcus sat in the second row, Diane in the third. The gallery was packed. Chefs, students, journalists, strangers who had driven hours. A group of black women from Edisto Island sat near the back. One of them had known Meme Josephine. Julian's team arrived with the confidence of men who bill by the hour. 3 lawyers in dark suits. Julian sat behind them, tanned, pressed, composed. A man attending an inconvenience. Julian's lead attorney opened with precision. Employment contracts, work-for-hire doctrine. Every dish created during employment belongs to the establishment under the executive chef's direction. Nadine was a line cook. Whatever she produced was Julian Mercer's output. Clean, cold, almost reasonable, if you didn't know anything about the hands that actually made the food. Keisha stood up. She didn't argue law first. She presented evidence, Marcus's time-stamped photographs. Nadine alone at 4:30 in the morning, developing dishes that wouldn't appear on Julian's social media until weeks later. Supplier invoices showing low-country ingredients ordered exclusively by Nadine. Julian's texts. "Make that shrimp thing, I'm presenting it Thursday." And, "Don't come to the press dinner, better if I represent the kitchen alone." Then the cultural historian, Dr. Yvonne Pratt, University of South Carolina, testified that the notebook's recipes predated Nadine's employment by decades. The techniques were Gullah Geechee tradition. These were cultural inheritance, not work product. Julian's lawyers objected. Overruled. Keisha called Nadine to the stand. Nadine sat down, hands flat on the wooden surface. Keisha asked, "Can you describe your creative process?" Nadine didn't give a legal answer. "Every dish I make starts with my grandmother's hands. I can still feel them guiding mine. The way she'd tilt the pot, the way she'd say, 'Listen to it, Nadine, the oil is talking to you.' When I cook, I'm not performing. I'm continuing a conversation that started before I was born." She held up the notebook. The courtroom went still. "This man wants to own what's inside these pages. But you can't own a grandmother's love. You can't patent the way a woman fed her whole island with nothing but what the land and water gave her. She never had a restaurant. She never had a title. She had this notebook and 2 hands that never stopped giving. You can argue about contracts and work product, but you cannot take a grandmother from her granddaughter's hands. These recipes are not corporate property. They are love, written down. And I will fight for them the way she would have, quietly, firmly, and without stopping. Real silence. The kind that falls when every person in a room holds the same breath. A woman from Edisto Island pressed a handkerchief to her face. Marcus gripped the bench. Diane stopped writing. Julian's attorney attempted cross-examination. 2 questions before his rhythm broke. Nadine answered each with facts, dates, and the quiet certainty of lived truth. There was nothing to dismantle. During recess, Julian's publisher terminated the cookbook deal, citing irreconcilable concerns about attribution. His agent issued a separate statement parting ways. In under 90 minutes, the professional identity Julian spent 15 years building on someone else's foundation had collapsed entirely. Julian sat behind his lawyers, pale and diminished. Then came the moment nobody expected. Richard Ashworth asked to testify. Voluntarily, no subpoena. He told Keisha he had something to say under oath. He took the stand, looked out at the courtroom, at Nadine, at the gallery, at the women from Edisto Island. I've built 47 hotels. I've hosted presidents and kings. And on the night that mattered most, I looked at the most talented person in my building, and I didn't see her. Not because she was hiding, because I wasn't looking. I was looking for what I expected genius to look like. And I was wrong. His voice was stripped of authority. This wasn't a CEO. This was a man in the wreckage of his own assumptions. Nadine Leclerc didn't just create a menu. She carried a culture into a room that had never made space for it. She fed people who would never have learned her name if she hadn't demanded to be seen. I failed her that night. And I'm here because I refuse to fail her again. He looked at the judge. The recipes in that notebook don't belong to my company. They don't belong to Julian Mercer. They belong to Josephine Leclerc, who wrote them with hands that never stopped giving. And they belong to her granddaughter, who turned them into art. I'm asking this court to see what I should have seen from the beginning. Richard stepped down, didn't look at Julian. The judge retired for 40 minutes. When she returned, the courtroom held its breath. The ruling: recipes constituted personal cultural heritage, not corporate work product. Julian's claims dismissed with prejudice, restraining order denied. Nadine closed her eyes. Marcus grabbed her hand. Keisha exhaled for the first time in hours. In the gallery, Zuri sat on Lorraine's lap. She tugged Lorraine's sleeve. Did Mama win? Lorraine pulled the girl closer, eyes wet. She did more than win, sweetheart. The courtroom emptied slowly, but one image stayed. Nadine walking down the steps into afternoon sunlight, the notebook against her chest, her daughter's hand in hers, and for the first time in her life, her name on the right side of the record. 3 months later, on a warm January evening, the lights inside Orem came on for the first time since the trial. But it wasn't the same restaurant. Not anymore. The sign above the entrance had been replaced. Where it once read Orem in cold gold lettering, anonymous, corporate, belonging to no one and everyone, it now read something different. Something that made people stop on the sidewalk and look up. Orem, by Nadine Leclerc. Below it, in smaller script, a line that most people had to step closer to read. Rooted in the kitchen of Josephine Leclerc, Edisto Island. Nadine stood across the street for a full minute before crossing. She wanted to see it from a distance first, the way a stranger would see it, walking past on an ordinary night. Her name, in lights. Above a door she once walked out of in a waitress apron with her grandmother's notebook in her pocket and nothing else. She crossed the street, pushed through the front door, and the kitchen staff, her staff, applauded. Not the polite kind, the real kind. The kind that starts with one person and spreads until the whole room is standing and the sound fills every corner. Marcus was at the front, clapping harder than anyone, wearing a sous chef coat with his name on it for the first time. Behind him, the line cooks, the prep team, the dishwashers, the people who had watched Nadine carry this kitchen in silence for 18 months. They knew. They had always known. Nadine pressed her hand to her mouth, nodded, breathed, then tied on her apron and said the only thing that mattered. "We have guests coming in 2 hours. Let's cook." The new menu was built entirely from the notebook. Every dish a conversation between Meme Josephine's tradition and Nadine's evolution. Gullah rice with creek shrimp, she crab soup with smoked paprika cream, bourbon pecan tart with sea salt from Edisto, and at the center of it all, the dish that had started everything, now carrying its true name for the first time. Meme Josephine's Gullah Butter Grouper, the same dish that made Richard Ashworth stand up at his gala, the same dish that earned a James Beard nomination under another man's name, the same dish whose recipe was written in an old woman's handwriting on a stained page held together with tape and love. Now it belonged to the woman who created it and the woman who carried it forward. The first plate went out at 7:15. A diner, a woman who had driven from Savannah after reading Diane's article, took one bite and closed her eyes. She stayed like that for a long moment. When she opened them, she was crying. Not because the food was sad, because it was true. 2 weeks after the relaunch, Richard held a press conference in the hotel ballroom. He stood behind a podium and announced the creation of the Josephine Leclerc Culinary Scholarship, full funding for 3 young chefs per year from underrepresented communities. No culinary degree required, no pedigree, just proof that you could cook, that someone taught you with love, and that you were ready to carry it forward. Nadine stood beside him as he made the announcement. She didn't speak during the press conference itself. She didn't need to. Her presence was the statement, standing where she'd once been invisible, wearing a chef's coat with her name on it, in a room that now answered to her kitchen. The first scholarship recipients were announced that same evening, 3 young cooks. One of them was a 17-year-old girl from Edisto Island named Amara, who cooked dinner for her 4 siblings every night after school because their mother worked double shifts. Amara had never been inside a professional kitchen. She had never heard of the James Beard Award, but she could make a pot of frogmore stew that tasted like the ocean wrote a love letter. When Nadine handed Amara the scholarship letter, the girl stared at it like she was holding something breakable.
"Is this real?"
Amara whispered. Nadine smiled, the same smile she gave Zuri when the world didn't make sense, but the answer was simple. "It's real, baby, and you earned it." That evening at the relaunch dinner, Richard fulfilled his final condition. He stood before the guests, many of the same faces from the gala 3 months earlier. The same chandeliers, the same crystal, but a different room, because the truth had rearranged everything. He turned to Nadine. "I owe you an apology, not the kind my lawyers wrote, the kind that costs something." He paused. The room was completely silent. "I looked at you and decided I already knew who you were. I saw what I was taught to see, and I missed what was right in front of me. Your name should have been on this door from the first night. I'm sorry it took me this long." Nadine looked at him. She didn't cry. She didn't hug him. She did something harder than both. She simply nodded. A single nod that said, "I hear you. I believe you mean it. And now we move forward." Then she extended her hand. Richard took it. A handshake. Eye to eye. Not a billionaire and a line cook, not an owner and an employee. 2 people, standing level. "Apology accepted," Nadine said. "Now let me feed your guests." She turned and walked into the kitchen. The doors swung shut behind her. Through the round window, the guests could see her tying on her apron, opening the notebook, running her finger down a recipe. And then she began to cook. In the restaurant's entrance, beside the host stand where guests waited to be seated, a glass display case had been installed. Inside it, under soft light, sat the notebook. It was open to the Gullah Butter Grouper recipe, Meme Josephine's handwriting, the margin note about the roux, the oil stain in the corner from a kitchen 40 years gone. Beside it, a small brass plaque. The recipes of Josephine Leclerc, 1941 to 2022. She fed everyone. She asked for nothing. Her granddaughter made sure the world knew her name. On the night of the relaunch, after the last guest left and the kitchen was cleaned and the staff had gone home, Nadine brought Zuri to see it. Just the two of them, standing in the quiet entrance of a restaurant that now carried their family's name. Zuri pressed her hand against the glass. Her small fingers spread wide, reaching toward the notebook she had watched her mother hold 1,000 times. "That's Maymay's book, Mama." "That's Maymay's book, baby, and nobody can take it away." Zuri looked up. "Is Maymay happy?" Nadine knelt down so they were eye to eye. She thought about Edisto Island, about oysters on a grate, about a woman who never left a 30-mile radius but whose love was now served under crystal chandeliers to people who would remember her name. "Yeah, baby, Maymay's happy." Late that night, after Zuri was asleep, Nadine sat alone in the Orem kitchen. The restaurant was dark except for the light above her station. She reached into her bag and pulled out something new. A notebook, brand new, blank pages, a clean spine uncracked by years or fire or grief. She opened to the first page, picked up a pen, and wrote, "For Zuri, so you'll always know where you come from." Then she turned to the second page and began writing a recipe, her own this time. Something new, something that started with Meme's foundation but grew toward a flavor Nadine had been carrying in her mind for years, waiting for the moment she had a kitchen, a name, and a daughter to write it for. The camera would pull back here, if this were a film. Through the kitchen window, past the clean stations and the hanging copper pots, past Meme Josephine's photograph on the wall, out through the front of the restaurant where the sign glowed softly against the Charleston night. Her name, lit up, finally. He asked for the chef. He wasn't ready for the answer, but she was. If this story moved you, share it with someone who's ever been overlooked. And if you're the one who's been invisible, keep cooking. The world will catch up. Subscribe so we can keep telling stories the world tries to forget. She didn't need anyone's permission to be brilliant. She just needed someone brave enough to look. And now, the whole world was watching.
A billionaire screamed, "Where is the chef?" And when they pointed at Nadine, he said, "Not the waitress." The same man stood in a courtroom months later and apologized to her by name. And this is what Nadine's story taught me. Your work doesn't disappear just because someone else puts their name on it. Julian took her recipes. He took her grandmother's love, his mount for the cameras, and called it his vision. Nadine didn't fight with anger. She fought with evidence. She let the truth build quietly, slowly, until it was so loud that no one could ignore it. And her 7-year-old daughter looked a billionaire in the face and said, "Don't try, do it." My teacher says, trying is just a fancy word for maybe. The little girl understood something powerful. You don't ask for what's already yours, you claim it. And that's exactly what Nadine did. Not just for herself, but for every woman whose work has been stolen and repackaged under someone else's name. Have you ever done the work, the real work, and watched someone else take the bowl? Did you stay quiet, or did you fight for your name? Because here's what Mrs. Josephine wrote in that notebook. The flavor knows where it came from, and so does your talent. Don't let anyone rename what's yours. Tell me in the comments, what's something you built that someone else tried to claim? Share this with a woman who needs to hear her own name out loud today. Like and subscribe my channel. And remember, she didn't need anyone's permission to be brilliant. She just needed the word to finally look.